we could think about starting. I was just sort of reviewing some of my thinking around this this paper, around your theory, Davor, and I was looking at enfrainment again today, and something that popped out at me. I just want to quote this very briefly, just to give you some idea about where I'm coming from and what the gaps in my own knowledge here. And as I sort of try to wrap my head around this theory, which is quite elaborate, actually. There are lots of details to it, which is what I find so interesting and compelling about it. But I have a difficulty with Heidegger, always have. But this author, I'm reading about culture in the mind, and this author is quoting Heidegger, and he's talking about enframing, and it made sense to me. He says, for Heidegger, enframing is not merely a set of techniques aimed at control. It is an attitude of modern humankind toward their world, which treats the phenomenon of the world as standing reserves, resources to be harnessed and manipulated for human ends, where the whole world becomes as totally transparent to human manipulation, Heidegger believes, it darkens, losing something of the poetic indwelling, which should mark what Heidegger likes to call the coming into being with the world. And this author goes on and says that technology has granted us an extraordinary power to synthetically reconfigure our experience of the world by altering our picture of the world. In computer circles, this ultimate enframing activity goes by the name virtual reality. And he goes on to say, he's talking about traditional cultures now. He says that the closest that a traditional society could come to the creation of such a virtual reality might be a parallel reality to which a shaman might have access by means of a hallucinogen. But the worldview within which shamanic excursions take place is completely different from that which makes virtual reality possible. Virtual reality is the creation of a modular view of reality in which the world as construct is deliberately altered by a digitally masterminded reconfiguration of the senses. So this is, and he goes on to quote Heidegger some more. But this author says that whether or not all reality is a virtual construct, in fact, it does matter a great deal if one conceives of reality in this way. And surely most people in the world would agree that reality is not virtual. This notion that reality is always and everywhere human construction is, of course, a central tenet of modern phenomenology-oriented social science. It seems that virtual reality is pretty central to postmodern ontology. So I'm just bringing that up because I think we forgot about Heidegger last time. And now that I've sort of reviewed that a little bit, I resonate with that a lot more, and why Heidegger is important to this theory. And so I'm just adding that. And also my fascination with the theory of the imagination. So I think we really need to work on that, because I don't think we do have a very adequate theory of imagination, especially when we think about intergenerational shifts that are happening. I know since most of my adult life, a lot of my adult life was before the internet. So it was a very different world. And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing different generations mixing it up. And some of the generations, of course, have never been in a world without the internet. So they have, and flat screens are increasingly the norm for their communication systems. So I think this is challenging because people from my age often think of reality as a place where people gather face to face, exchange communication, come up with plans, act upon those plans. And that is something that's maybe dying out. Because I think many more people, especially who've been brought up with this kind of technology, which I'm fascinated by, but I also see some dangers in it. I think that they don't see, I think that it's a different setup for them. And I've witnessed this over and over in my communications with younger people and my observation of their communications with one another. So I think this is I just want to throw that out there. And also Barrett, if something has come up for you this week, since last week, that you want to channel a little bit right here at the beginning, that's great. And then we'll turn it over to you, Davor, and you can take it wherever you want to.
Oh, no, that was great. And actually that kind of touches on some of the things that I've been thinking about, because right now we have, as you say, it's like, we're kind of in this position where, especially when you talk about postmodern ontology, we basically are kind of, I think, caught between two different sets of views. You have the sort of reborn Platonic view that is just ultra materialist, ultra rationalist. Then you have the postmodern ontology. And what I'm trying to wonder is there a place that we can go to that transcends, or doesn't necessarily transcends, but just sort of veers off from not necessarily being anti-materialism, because I'm not a pure constructivist. I obviously think that there's some, there's a material reality that sort of, ties us all together. It's just, I don't think materialism is everything. And I think that that's only one fraction. Like we have the manifest image, and we have, as they call it, and then we have something that lies behind it. But I don't know if that makes any sense, but like, how do we come into a place? And I think that one of the interesting things about layers of generativity and second order culture is it's helping us find a way to give almost real life, or as they say, actually in MCS, I think the theory of verticality is really interesting to me, because the way in which cultures, they kind of live and they die, it has some correlation with how species interact, post-stress and in relaxation periods. And I think to tie those two things together is like a very aha moment, like, oh wow, maybe we can actually find this third place that's not necessarily one or not necessarily the other, and I think that's ideally what I'm kind of like interested in finding out, because there are two sides of this thing, and they're just kind of going back and forth, and they're manifesting themselves as in real social ways. I mean, in real political ways, and I think that's, it gets to be this really big problem where you have, I don't know. Oh, okay. All right.
TJ.
Yeah. So how do we stop, and create something that can kind of merge the two, or come up with some kind of equal liquid to oil balance? And that's basically it.
Well, hey TJ, we can see your face again.
It works.
It works.
Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear
I can
me?
hear you. We hear you fine. We were Barrett and I were just sharing our some of our thoughts and feelings about reading this text and reflecting on Davor's theory. And I was wondering, TJ, if you would have anything to share with us right at the beginning before we turn over the microphone to Davor, if you have any.
Which text?
Well, the one we just read, and I think some of us read the Heidegger text on unframing. Remember that one on technology a few weeks ago, but we didn't get to talk about that much last time. And I know we're all sort of putting this theory together because there's a lot of details in it. And I think this essay is extremely interesting we just read. So if there's anything that's coming up for you that you want to share right at the beginning.
No, I'll let Davor start. The MSc article is the one that I read over the weekend, which I really enjoyed.
Okay. So if anything does come up, feel free.
Sure.
So Davor, it's your turn. Take it away.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks. I'm so happy that TJ didn't have to say anything because, the other guys asked the question about whole reality itself, right? So it's kind of, we ask a very, very big, huge question. So I don't know where to start now, really. Can you please tell me who wrote that Heidegger book?
Oh, I was
the one that you were quoting from.
It's not a book on Heidegger, it's a book on culture.
And who wrote that?
It's written by a guy named Brad Shore. He's writing on cognitive psychology and anthropology. And he wrote a section on the modern mind and technology, and he referenced Heidegger a lot. So that's why I'm thinking of that.
Yeah, I think there were some misunderstandings, at least from my perspective, and maybe also from Heidegger's perspective too. Should I just keep on? Okay, I'll just keep on going.
Start wherever you want to start.
Just wherever. Okay, I'll link up everything later. Okay. I mean, no, the other way around. We will go through the network, and then you will see how things relate to each other. Okay, so when he said that that the enframement, how did he say it's more like a projection of modern production structures, right? He said that.
He says enframement is sort of. He's quoting Heidegger here. This is a direct quote. The fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as picture. The word picture, which in German is Bild, now means the structured image, Gebild. That is the creature of man's producing, which represents and sets before. In such producing, man contends for the position in which he can be that particular being who gives the measure and draws up the guidelines for everything that is.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, well, that's an interpretation of Heidegger, but you said something about the enframement earlier, like that is typical Western, and then you compared it to then he said that the virtual reality is a pure form of the enframement, and that early cultures don't have that. They do different things.
Oh, I apologize. I sort of jumped ahead because I'm interested in the difference between the virtual.
Yeah, that's what I want to get to. Yes.
And many of the archaic mind, the closest thing they could come to the virtual would be, hallucinogens or trance states or something like that. Different worlds that were parallel worlds, but not anything like what's going on with virtual reality.
Yes, and I think this is the mistake. This is the misreading in that case of this author or of this writer of Heidegger. The point is this: that the enframement is everything we are in. So when the shaman of an early culture takes whatever hallucinogen he can take or something, and then when he transfers it, and when he transfers the experience again into the culture, he talks about it and invites other people to take. You need to interpret it, right? Otherwise, there's pure subjective chaos. You need to reframe it, so to speak, into a symbol system or into some communicative system. It has to have some effect. Anyway, the point is, all this is enframing. Okay, so this is the misunderstanding. The enframing is not, enframement, actually, sorry. And the enframement is not only modern technology. It's not only the moment when we start making pictures, like, starting with the perspective painting with geometry or something like this in beginning of modernity, or with Newton's formulas or something like this. Enframement is the basic condition of the human, revealing the enframement. So we are revealing ourselves with the enframement, so to speak. It's codependent. Human and enframement are codependent. So in other words, I'm talking about Heidegger. I'm not saying that reality is like this. Okay, I'm just saying what the enframement is. So the point is, Heidegger would never say that that the shaman is somehow distanced from the enframement or something like this, right? And that only the technological virtual reality is something, where the enframement comes up in its purest form or something like this. That's not what he's saying. But Heidegger himself probably did not distinguish between, let's say, different stages of enframement. Okay, so this would be a difference, so to speak. I mean, where you could make a difference to distinguish between the experiences and the way of being in early cultures and today's cultures. So there are differences, right? So why I just wanted to point at this enframement was, just to point from this theory, which was written at the same time when Gebser wrote his, how do you say in English, origin and
ever-present origin. The ever-present origin.
The ever-present, okay, the ever-present origin. So when he wrote it, I think it was in 48 or something published, and Heidegger started his, let's say the first technology text also at 46, like after the war, right? So, but he's a different generation. It's also important. So Heidegger was born in 1889 and Gebser in 1905 or something like this. So there's a 16-year gap. That means a lot because we were socialized under different conditions, right?
Right.
So for example, so in other words, they had different experiences in their lifetime, and other theories, so to speak, grew out of their experiences. So what I wanted to say with why I was pointing at the enfrainment was just to show that that even our minds, our subjectivity, so to speak, or what we consider as existence, I mean, the subject as it is, as it pronounces itself in the world, is not free of technology. I mean, it's not free of being influenced by technology. It's not free of having been brought up by, in a culture, basically. So there's no way that you can have a conscious. Okay, this is now me speaking probably. So there's no way that you can have a pronounced, like a shaped conscious that is not socialized, that has not been cultivated by something. Even if you are, even if you grew up in the bushes or something, like in the forest or in the jungle for yourself, without parents or culture, still you will interact with the environment, right? And something will influence you from this environment. So in other words, the contents of the mind are to some degree definitely coming from the outside, so to speak. And the outside is always a technological outside, and therefore you cannot really detach consciousness. Okay, that maybe is a strong word. Okay, let's say you cannot detach subjective, the subjective. How should I say this? The self. You cannot detach the self from a certain type of technology. That means your motives, for example, motives are partially also part of the body, right? So the desires, how do you say this in English? The drives, right? What drives us, hunger and stuff like this. So this is maybe part of the body, but normativity, what we consider as good or bad or something like, is always a part of the culture, right? So now, so we are socialized beings, and this is part of the enfrainment. So in other words, you cannot think norms or subjectivity without the enfrainment in general. Just in general. So we don't talk about the structure of the concrete enfrainment, but just that there's a correlation between technology and the norms and motives and whatever, and even dreams in a way. So not the fact that we can dream and project and fantasize, but how we, the content of what we project and fantasize. So you can see that on the history of science fiction, you will see that always it's mirroring, reflecting the contemporary technologies. So the science fiction writers, of course, they are capable to extrapolate deeper into the future because why? Because we simply have the time to do that. We're sitting there on the desk all day long, and we just think, okay, what's going next? What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? And then they extrapolate a technological, for example, future that makes sense from the as an extrapolation of the tendencies that we witness in their presence. Yeah, Jules Verne, like 20,000 miles below the sea, or shooting people with a cannon to the moon and stuff like this. So it makes sense, in some sort. So the content of the imagination makes sense sometimes, and it can realize itself, but it's definitely not detached. So they're detached from the contemporary. I wouldn't say zeitgeist, culture. Let's just say culture, from the techno-cultural state. And the same goes, of course, for philosophers like Deleuze or something like this. When Deleuze and the postmodernists today have became revitalized in the last couple of years again, then this is for a simple reason. I can give you many people who could be revitalized but weren't, that also were writing in the 70s. Why? Because they are scientists. You know, they sit there all day and they find deeper structures which we don't see because we live in them. You know what I'm saying? So we are just performing them, so to speak, and they have the time to think about to think about these structures, and then they can extrapolate them. In the beginning, when they see them as scientists, they are only producing abstractions from certain dots, right? And until these tendencies that they see realize in real reality, it takes usually 20 to 30 years or 40 years maybe, or something like this, right? You see my point? So in other words, even the theory people, like as I said, like where you would think that there is pure, how should I say, even philosophers that would maybe claim that there is a pure thinking mind, you know, which is detached from the reality, which is thinking about reality and thinking about the world, is never detached from the cultural surroundings, so to speak. And in that sense, also part of the enframement, right? So this, yeah, I mean, if you want to stay with the word enframement, at least. So what did I want to say with that? Okay, so this would be just as an introduction. Now, I could make a link now a little bit to Gebser if you want to, but if you have questions or you know, you can interrupt me anytime. I'm not. So now the point is this, and here we can link now maybe everything that was asked before, in a way. If we look now at history, like Gebser did, for example, right, then we see that obviously there are different types of mind, right? So there are different ways to do that. For the way I, chose to do that was, I mean, it wasn't me. It was just based on the work that I was provided with by the archaeologists. So you can look, for example, at technology in the early stages of the human, and then you can derive from the technology what kind of minds have been existing at this time. Yeah. So what does it mean? It means that you can look at the tools, and then you can just try to imagine what kind of cognitive or regulative behavior was behind the production and the use of these tools. Okay, so you can derive.
Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe it's just me. Okay.
Okay. So what kind of cognitive structures must have been in the background of producing and using these tools, for example, right? So, and now we are just talking about the tools. We're not talking about everything else around the tools. Okay, we don't know what the humans did at this time. We don't know if they, if they were wearing hats or they're singing all day long. Who knows? You know what I'm saying? So we don't know this. We just have a tiny piece of, this one. The archaeologist Miriam Heidegger always says you have to imagine that you have a puzzle of 1,000 pieces, and you have 50 pieces, and now you have to complete the whole picture, so to speak, right? So in that sense, of course, this is all speculative, but still, what we see is definitely that the complexity of the technology is changing. So this is definitely happening. Okay, so this is so we have and what we also see, given the current data, is that there are no jumps. There is no jump from the stone tool to the car or something like this, or to the electric light bulb or something like that. So it's gradual, it's cumulative. Yeah. So what I'm saying is basically this enframement of which Heidegger is talking about. He would say, of course, this is a general feature of the universe that was even there before the human. But we have to say that it started with the human, with the first secondary tool use, with the moment technology appeared, right? Okay, let me think now how to put this now in words. Okay, anyway, so if you look now at the history, then you see that there are different types of imagination in history. For example, there were times when there is no trace of any sort of science fiction or something like this. So just for an example. So there are times in history where you cannot see that people were actively thinking about some sort of future. That means not only this, you even cannot find any trace of some sort of future-oriented linear time frame or something like that. Okay, so that means imagination, of course, is always there with humans. In the moment when you go hunting, you already imagine that you will be going hunting, right? And how it will work. You imagine this whole narrative of hunting. So imagination was always there in some sense, right? I mean, it's kind of a defining feature of the human anyway, but it also comes in different structures. So it's a difference if you can imagine something if you are capable of having language or if you're not capable of having language. Okay, so anyway, what I'm saying is that if you look now at history, then you see you can derive from what you find certain features of the mind. Okay, so you can derive from the data, from the records, you can derive certain features of the mind, and you can see what is there and what is not there. So you can make like a little scale, you know, and then you cross, okay, do we have the feature of imagination? Yes, yes, yes. Do we have the feature of syntax, you know, something like this, or grammar? Yes, yes, yes. And this culture doesn't, or this organism doesn't, you know what I'm saying? So you can make like a, it's called a Goodman scale. That means you have features and then you compare cultures, and then you see some features, some cultures have the features and some cultures don't have the features. Right, for example, there are many cultures who don't have a concept of, let's say, irrational numbers, okay, something like this. So you can sum up the cultures, and then you make a cross, you know, who has irrational numbers, who doesn't have irrational numbers. Then you can go even further. You can ask who is capable of thinking complex numbers, or since when did people start thinking complex numbers, right? Or for example, mathematical proofs and so on. Okay, so this is how, yeah, I mean, in a way, how I approached in this work this question of the history and future of metaphysics, so to speak. So I'm looking back and trying to see traces, not of the concrete contents of the mind, but of the structures which are in the background, which are developing with every culture. Okay, so okay, to just put it in one sentence, and then I'll just make a break for a moment. So so what I could show, or what I've seen, let's say like this, or what I found based on works of many others, is that you can see that whenever the operational chains are deepening in history, so when you have like a shift, a qualitative shift in operational chains or cooperation, as TJ pointed me at the book of the guy, I forgot the name again, Networks, the global web, or what the name was of the book again, the global net of the historian, that humans are expanding their net, right, their cooperation net. Anyway, so
Human web.
the human web. Okay, exactly. Yes, exactly. So the human web. So the point is this: the human web basically starts 3 million years ago, but only around 40 million years ago, when the media start. This is the onset of civilizational history. That means the operational chains are starting to connect cultures or collectives. So it's not only one little collective or one human producing operational chains, but through media you can start forming you know, the human web, what was it, net, you can start forming bigger connections anyway. And so just like in early human evolution, so to speak, you can see that there are distinct stages and grades of technology which always come with a new type of mind, with a new type of metaphysics, and new type of temporality, and new types of cognition. They must, yeah. Just in the same way you can find in later history such, let's say, qualitative stages or breaks or something like this, right? Okay, so and what I've shown now is to summarize it quickly, is that whenever you have a shift in these operational chains, in the collective operational chains, then you have a new type of cognitive structure appearing, and a new type of temporality, and a new type of metaphysics, like materialism, for example, in modernity, like the classic philosophy in Greece, in axial age. You know, at the same time when money was invented or introduced, and when the alphabet was introduced. You know, at the same time you have a shift both in thinking and in the depth of operational chains, right? Because through writing you can establish new depths of operational chains. Yeah, and that's basically the whole story of my whole work. You know, see, it's not so complicated. It's summarized in one sentence. So whenever you have a shift in a shift, an extension, a qualitative extension of the operational chains, then you have a differentiation of the mind, of the worldview, of metaphysics. You get a new type of metaphysics. Yeah, this is the story, and that's why, to get back to this book you quoted earlier, the enfrainment is always there. The shaman is just in another type of realization or concretization of the shaman. Right? and also to say that virtual reality would be the realization of the enfrainment is in one way a little bit trivial, because every technology is, so this glass is also the realization of the enfrainment. So everything is, there's nothing special in that sense about virtual reality. And Heidegger would even say it's even maybe he would even say, okay, point is this, he would say nothing, because if he would write it today, he would write it totally differently. But if he would say something at this time, he would maybe even say that virtual reality is just the opposite of the enfrainment. It's even taking us away from the enfrainment in a way. Why? Because it's so cultural that it covers again what can be revealed by technology, by the enfrainment. Anyway, I can expand it, and I would like to later. But this, you see, the interesting thought here is this: that the virtual reality is that there is more potential in virtual reality than virtual reality is known for, so to speak. There's a bigger emancipative and philosophical and existential potential in virtual reality than we know yet. Why? Because up to now it's just a projection of Western cultural existence, so to speak. But we don't know what is going to happen when we start using all the potentials of virtual reality in another culture, which will use it maybe one day. So this is. I'm not propagating virtual reality. I'm just saying that what we understand today as virtual reality is a culturally biased understanding of what it is. Yeah. Okay, so this. Okay, so far on that. I don't know if that made sense. And yeah, that's. I don't know if.
Well, that does. Can I
yeah, sure.
interject now? Because I want to give you plenty of time to cover everything you want to cover in this introductory. But I'm just thinking of like dream states. The difference between virtual reality, what we're calling virtual reality, and dream states are very subtle experiences or fantasies about some future vacation you want to take, or a memory of something that happened when you were a child. And the differences of what people remember and what people forget. I mean, I remember episodes from my childhood, and I remember one specific, very traumatic episode that I had, and both of my parents were there. And as an adult, I went to my father and I told him this memory, which was, I was about 3 years old, and he remembered it. I went to my mother, the same memory, and I told it to her. She says, I don't remember that at all. So I had to sort of figure out, okay, what's reality here? What really happened? What's my imagination? What did I take from that and interpreted from that experience? What did I later on decide to reject from that experience? So I think that's what's troubling to me about shared memories collectively. How do we hold these memories and pass them on to the next generation with this technology that is so pervasive, and where I think there are different levels in people's discourse that they're operating from, and there are different senses that they are paying more attention to. I remember not too long ago in a train, I saw a conversation between two strangers. It was a young man. He was in his early 20s, and she was in her early 20s. Two young people, opposite sex. Obviously, there was some attraction. He started to flirt with her, and she started to respond very cautiously. He got up from his seat and sat next to her, and he pulled out his smartphone. And he started telling her a story about his work. But then he stopped and he just showed, here, I'll show you. And he had a video of himself at his work with his boss and a whole scene that occurred. And they were just sitting there for the next 10 minutes. They were just like chortling. They were chuckling and and making grunts. You know? And I felt a little cheated because I wanted some good dialogue so that I could write it down in my journal and have a story, a short story that I could then share with other people about this budding romance, right? But I think that's what it's shifting so rapidly right now, is that our communication systems are just in such enormous flux. And I thought one of the things that was brought up in this, this essay about texting, and how after a movie, people quickly pull out their smartphone and they're texting strangers, or they're texting their community who's not physically present, and they're not paying attention to the person that is physically present, because that person is on their smartphones and texting their absent community, physically absent community. And I think these are the new kinds of practices, I guess you'll call them. But I think I think our senses are being impacted or being rearranged by these kind of practices. Also, I wanted to talk a little bit something Barrett was mentioning about, I think there's something about rhythms. And we have diurnal rhythms, like every 24 hours, so we have to fall asleep and have about 8 hours sleep. We also have ultradian rhythms, which are every 90 minutes. There's a cycle of rest that's required. We have activity and rest every 90 minutes. So within that 90 minutes, you may have a tendency during a period of hyperactivity. You want to yawn, you want to stretch, you want to look out the window, close your eyes and relax a little bit. Unfortunately, in our culture, we tend to override this natural 90-minute cycle of rest and activity. We ignore the rest period and just constantly are in hyperactive. And I think our technology feeds these tendencies to be hyperactive. And I think it's taking its toll psychologically on a lot of people. So I'm just sharing that with you guys. I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but I think that I remember the first dream that I had about a computer. And it was in the 90s. And I didn't have a personal computer at that time, but at my office we did. And I remember very vividly, I had a dream, and in the dream, and it was a lucid dream. I was an active lucid dreamer from a very early age. And I was in this computer, there was a room full of computers. And I said, is there anyone here who can teach me something? And then a man appeared in a white lab coat. And he said, we can't teach you anything, but you can teach us something. And I said, okay. And he said, look in the screen of that computer. And there was a little blue dot. And it went into like the center of my brain, or my dreaming brain. And it made this configuration and a kind of buzzing sensation. And then the guy in the lab coat said, thank you very much. I said, you're welcome. And I woke up. But that was the first time I had a dream about a computer. Not the last time. I have dreams about computers all the time. But we know from history, from studying the imaginary and the dream lives of previous people, you know, they had dreams about bows and arrows and spears and chariots. And that we don't have now. And so I think so I'm sort of agreeing that there's something about this enfrainment idea and how we can't separate our consciousness from the technology that we're using every day. Whether it's books or laptops or telephones, they're going to get into, you know, our unconscious and come forward in dream states. So I'm just sharing that. I don't know where I want to go with this, but I'm just putting that out there.
It's interesting that you mentioned bows and arrows, because I actually have a lot of dreams with bows and arrows. You know, and a lot of it entails me riding either a horse or a vehicle backwards in reverse as people on horseback, hovercraft, Jeep, in various settings, you know, sort of like, you know, like the jungles of Vietnam are actually chasing me, and they're going forward. I'm in reverse and they're shooting bows and arrows at me. And I have no idea where this comes from. You know, it's like, but it's like a strange reoccurring theme often when my sleep gets interrupted, and say I fall back asleep because I didn't sleep enough, and then I oversleep, and then I manage within that 3 to 4 hour period of going back to bed and waking up too late, have a dream where I'm being chased and people are shooting bows and arrows at me, but I'm always going in reverse and they're always going forward. So I have no idea. And for some reason, this has been happening for years. Every year I say, well, I couldn't have another dream that involves this chase with bows and arrows. And then like every year, it just seems to happen at least once, if up to 1 to 4 times a year. So it's actually really interesting that you say that, because I don't think I've ever had a dream with a computer in it. So when you actually said that, I was like, whoa, that's like the complete opposite of my experience, because I have dreams about sandstorms a lot. I've had dreams about technology. I actually had a semi kind of like nervous breakdown off of a series of dreams that involved sandstorms. And one of them actually had to do with, I was waiting for the train in the morning, and on my way to work, I lived in Oakland. I worked in San Francisco as a file clerk. And, you know, I was like 23 years old, and I thought I was going to work. And then the entire off of the Bay Area Rapid Transit, the train pulls up and the entire top is just ripped off. And it's like by like velociraptors. And I look inside and everyone's sitting down and people are in their suits commuting, and their faces are just exposed fleshy skulls, you know, like they had been burned or like mauled or something. And then I just woke up, you know. So that was probably like, and that was probably why that dream affected me so much, is because it did mirror my reality, is we're like, you know, or my sort of day-to-day, you know, experience. So that, I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't really know what that all means though. You know, I'm still working through that. But
the first one means that you go against the grain. I'm not sure if you were going in reverse or everybody else was going in reverse.
Oh, I was going in reverse and everyone else was going forward, shooting bows and arrows at me.
Are you sure about that? That they're the ones who are actually going forward?
I'm positive that they were going forward, and
okay.
I was going reverse in the same direction, but they were chasing me. So
I was giving you the credit of being the visionary in that, but
I don't know. I wouldn't give myself that credit. But, that's an interesting interpretation, I suppose. That's a good one.
Well, I think that to tie this in with this new essay and some of the theory that we're trying to work with in these anterior futures, and using our imagination to bring forward a post-capitalist, post-money world, and how do we do that when we are so immersed in the daily tasks of making a living in a capitalist society, where you have to drive a car to work so you can maintain employment, so you can have a certain income, so you can take care of your kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we break the group trance, the collective hypnosis we're all in, so that we can perform all of these complex tasks that most of us don't want to perform if we had our choice about it, but we're stuck in it. And I think this is the challenge, is how do we use our imaginations to sort of get unstuck? And where's the personal in these networks that we're all using? How do we describe these interior spaces in ways that communicate effectively, rather than get us pathologized as kooks? You know, or new age kooks who should be, you know,
TJ shared that article in the New Republic, The Meaning of American Factories, and I think that, you know, and there was a quote and that said, when the factory dies, a whole world dies. And, you know, and I think that that's kind of this issue that we're having in that we may have to potentially face in the future as we shift into some post-capitalism, post-socialism, post-whatever situation. When we sort of break down the foundations of a world, like the factory wasn't, and it said somewhere in the article, the factory wasn't a place people wanted to go to. They weren't like excited to go to work in the factory, but it did frame
provided something.
Yeah, it's Gestell, right? That's the word Heidegger used for framing, correct? Is that right? Is that how you pronounce it? But so a lot of the things we sort of pine for because, you know, the old world has fragmented apart. And I think when we look at politics right now, we look at the sort of situation we've had with Trump, is that actually Chelsea Handler said something really interesting on the Bill Maher show. She was like, you know, a lot of my paranoia that dealt with this 2016 election and, you know, my anger and all this stuff was sort of this like trauma that I had not dealt with in my own personal life sort of coming out because it symbolized the fracturing of some world that I know, and I'd been completely deterritorialized, you know, as if, you know, in her own personal sense or whatever. And I think that that's kind of where we're headed now, is that you're going to have a lot of people who are going to say, well, neoliberalism and, you know, this late stage capitalism thing, you know, people are really, really good at finding ways to glorify nostalgia, you know, and to sort of, you know, personalize these old modalities, and in a lot of ways, you know, sort of weaponize things on a larger scale that have to do with actually less political and more personal sort of interpretations and inner trauma and all of these sort of inner experiences. So like, that's kind of what we're seeing now. And it's like, let's say we do convince this thing of happening. And I don't think you need to convince it. I actually think we're headed in that direction right now. Like, I almost feel like it could potentially be this process that we're just seeing happen, you know, and it's not something that we have to, because these ideas they're put out there. They're starting to be put out there. They're starting to be taken seriously. And then things sort of emerge from that. But like, how do we stop, you know, people from necessarily being reactionary towards something? Because I see that in just a lot of things today. You know, I see this kind of like this sort of over glorification of these things that they either completely utterly failed, or they succeeded for extended period times and sort of overstayed their welcome, you know. So that's kind of something that I've been thinking about lately. So if anyone else wants to chime in.
People remember things differently though. Like we're just talking about dreams and different interpretations, kind of probably where I'm coming from. It's like, oh, well, that sounds like you're going in the opposite direction, but maybe you're the one going in the right direction. People remember cultural things. I mean, that's the liturgy and the maximal stress event that Millman was talking about. And that's big. That's how, you know, I don't mind so much if something's going to fall apart and it's going to go, but what are you going to replace it with? Because I really need ground to stand on. That's like a really big, it's almost like an impulse, you know, an instinct in people. I
remember just this sort of melancholy memory, but when I saw, because right outside my window, 9/11, I saw the towers. I had a view of it right from outside my window. So I saw it. The first plane hit. I didn't see the first plane hit. I just heard a noise. And when I opened my eyes, because I was meditating on my couch in a very relaxed state, I opened my eyes and I saw the smoke. And then I called my friend and I said, oh, I think there's a terrorist attack happening. And I called her in California. She was my best friend, and she turned on the TV, and then we saw the second hit. And it was very weird because I had had many dreams about buildings being exploded in Manhattan, because I've lived in Manhattan so long. It was a very common theme, but it got this really weird feeling of the boundary between dream and reality got really blurred, not just for me, but I think collectively for a lot of people, where we all of a sudden felt like this is the worst kind of dystopian movie we'd ever seen, but it was real life. And I think those are that kind of trauma is reported often by people who are in traumatic episodes. They often say, I felt like I was in a movie, you know, that it was a really bad movie, and that I was a character acting out something. So I think that's a very common experience. Anyway, I'm just sharing that as I sort of resonate with this essay and the idea of maximum stress, cooperation, and you know, and I hope we don't have to rely upon trauma and collective trauma to get a sense of security and the pleasure that comes from a common purpose. You know, because I think that's not going to work anymore. So that's where I'm going with this, is what happens next. Anyway, Davor, I wonder if there's anything you could add to what we've been sharing here, if you can connect some of the dots for us.
No, I was thinking too, but I don't have much to say. I think I just remembered the only culture that ever chose to step down from a certain technological level to, you know, to go low again, like in that case in weapons technology, was Japan. Who I think right in the 17th century or what, they decided to get rid of how to say, fire.
The guns that the Portuguese had brought in the 1500s, and that's the wars until the Tokugawa unified everything, and then they said no more guns because we want our society to be stable.
Yeah, to stay with the samurai system or whatever what they had. Okay, so what I'm saying is that's also a little bit of a sad example, right? But it's not it's not that they chose it for prospective reasons, but for conservative reasons, right? So it was about stability, but not so to speak future oriented. So risk taking on a societal level is difficult to implement. The only driving force for risk taking on a society level is, I guess, American capitalism, where you just let the entrepreneur do whatever he likes, right? He has the right to do whatever he can if he can make profit, and then in the end we will see if it's good or not. If it's not good, then he can apologize later. You know what I'm saying? So this and this is it's there's a word for this actually, because in Germany or Europe you don't have that. It's called, I don't know, maybe something like principle of precaution or something like this. So before we inject a new technology in society, it has to be, double and triple checked and so on. By the way, the same, by the way, the same reason why the Germans are not anti-technology, but careful with technology, and the same reason why Heidegger was even writing, because the Germans became aware of technology as their own authoritative. Like technology as an own narrator of history or maker of history after the Second World War, because they saw, it was of course Hitler who lured us into this thing, but it was technology. We believed that we could do everything now with technology, right? So this, and the Germans and the Japanese were the first and only culture who realized what happens if you, let it off the leash, or how you say in English, when you just let it go. But I guess today we need maybe a new model, which is neither precautious, because you cannot stop it,
right?
And you can, of course, you can say Germany is going to halt its technology development, and of course it will not last very long, because other cultures don't stop and then they keep on going. So in other words, it's impossible to stop technology in the global competition, let's say like this. So earlier on maybe yes, but today it's not possible anymore, because if you stop, the other culture will just swallow you up. But on the other hand, we also obviously cannot just rely on this aleatoric technology induction by inventors. You know, but just let's see what's going to happen. Let's just inject it. Let's just see what we like Facebook, for example, right? So
I think you said that we can't just
yeah.
that the engineers
Hmm.
have got to be a part of this. The interiors, those who are creating this technology, have to be aware of their interior spaces and these narrative spaces, just as artists are. Or we're gonna just create greater incoherence rather than a coherent technology. We're going to just create greater and greater incoherence and further breakdowns in our communities around the world.
Yeah, this is a problem because you cannot imagine what the technology will bring before it's there. You know, so for example, the famous example is Edison when he invented the gramophone. It was he never thought about music. What he wanted to do was to record like last wishes of people who are dying for their family or something like this. You know, it was like a testament recording. No, not a testament, but more like for the voice. And he never came up with the idea, which is so logical to us now, right? To put music on, because at this time people couldn't imagine to put music, to detach music from a human, so to speak. It's always making, it's always being with others, right? So. So there are many examples of this unintended uses or unintended consequences of technology where people didn't even know, you know, when they invented it, what it is good for. Maybe the same goes actually for Facebook again, and nobody knew what Google is going to become in the beginning, right? So they just wanted to make a search engine because it made sense within the context, but nobody would have known what it became, right? So at this moment, because you cannot foresee what is going to emerge out of that. Yeah. I mean, the classical example is, classical example is the whole app market. So everybody could imagine somehow. I mean, I remember this. I was not surprised by the smartphone at all because it was just a logical conclusion. You have a display, you have a computer, and you have a telephone. We all knew that this is somehow going to happen, right? At least I knew. And many who lived in the 90s. It was not a surprise. But what you couldn't foresee was, of course, that it becomes such a big, huge technology, spider web of everything, basically, like apps surveilling your life, giving you tips, whatever, like for everything. So what I'm saying is you can imagine one step ahead, for example, the combination, but you cannot know what is going to grow out of this in the next step. This is impossible, And so, you see, we are still kind of talking about imagination and dreams and foreseeing the future and stuff. So I was just thinking when you were talking about these dreams, if there's any way to make this, so to speak, to make dreaming useful in that sense. And then I just came to the conclusion that both principles maybe don't work anymore. So neither the precautious principle nor the just do it principle, so to speak. But there needs to be some sort of module, some new module, as you're pointing out, like some mix, somehow imagination must be put into this.
Well,
some sort of collective imagination, maybe something like this. Maybe if I can finish quickly my thought in this moment. I was just thinking that if you look at the parties, the modern party system of parliamentarian democracies, right? So you have the left, the right, and in America you have only two, basically, big parties. But in Europe you have, a much bigger spectrum, so to speak. So you have the right and the liberal, and then the left, and then the very left, and so on. So the interesting thing is that all these parties appeared around 1830 at this time, approximately, like when modern democracies were established, like after the French Revolution and so on. And what is interesting about it is that every party is basically the embodiment of a utopia, right? So the liberals, they have their perception of what a human is, what a human should be, what is best for the human, and based on this, they are projecting their utopia, like a liberal utopia. The European way of liberal in the sense of market liberal capitalistic, so to speak, so not the American. And then you have the right, people who are conservative, maybe racist or something like this. They have also a perception or an image of what the human is universally, you know, in their perspective, so to speak. And based on this perspective, they are projecting a future or utopia that they want to realize within democratic in the beginning at least. So they want to be voted, to produce this totalitarian state, so to speak. And then again, the left again have another concept of what the human is. It's about sharing, it's about flourishing or something like this of the human mind. And based on this, we're also projecting an utopia. And all this started around 1830, right? So they are basically the embodiment of how should I say, the embodiment of a future directedness that is regulative in the moment, so to speak. So the utopia through the party is regulating behavior or institutions in the moment. And so what I want to say this is maybe that the time for this temporality itself is over. And I was just wondering if in the future maybe people should not vote for parties, but for states or something like this, for future scenarios or states. You see my point? So that this could be somehow connected to the possibilities of technology. Either we know them or not. So in other words, we could think of, you see what I'm heading? I cannot really formulate it. I'm just thinking maybe it doesn't make sense. But I was just thinking if we can somehow combine this, if maybe in this potential for dreaming or for imagining still is some sort of, if there is something in it that can be used, so to speak, to get out of this democratically enframed dreaming system, okay, which is left, right, and the whole spectrum between that. You see my point, because this is dreams. So it's when you make a cross, when you go to the election and you vote for this or that side of the spectrum, you're basically dreaming of a future, so to speak.
I think it's kind of strange right now, at least in the United States, that I think that we're kind of, in the past few years, we're kind of seeing the resurrection of utopianism, because I think for so long it was just to be accepted, that politicians, left, right, whatever, most of what they were saying were not utopianists, but they were actually just genuflecting and speaking to a contingency regardless of, whether or not their platforms were coherent, because in a lot of ways you're starting to see that on the other side right now, and that you have people kind of advocating for policies, left, right, whatever, and a lot of it you see on the sort of left right now, especially with the kind of extreme left in the United States, where it's like, within the framework of the nation state, given the fact that we have this system, you have a lot of people on the far left there advocating like open borders, but given the material conditions of today, you can't have any actual left economic policy if you have open borders. Like, that's actually impossible. Bernie Sanders actually just said this two days ago or something, and then obviously, a lot of the people come out and they say, oh, this is blah, 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 you're a racist or you're a this or that. It's not, it doesn't need to be framed that way. It's just given the conditions that are framing our current political situation. 100 years ago, okay, maybe this would have worked, but we're focused on right now. We have to focus on now what to do right now and the measures to take right now. So you can't, and so I see a lot of this issue as you see this like anti-materialism. You don't have to be a pure, sort of like overzealous materialist to necessarily kind of like refute the conditions that are supposed to like actually do frame the way in which our politics work. And it doesn't. So, and if we want to actually change something, we have to look and actually imagine completely different systems that aren't necessarily attached to these things because, you know, this kind of like state socialism is still it's still rooted in capital. I mean, it's all still rooted in the same thing. So like, how do we move beyond what we have right now, you know, because, and I just don't see a lot of people coming up with like actual creative even they can even be far-fetched. Like they don't have to be perfect, you know, like just come up with something different, like you know, and it's just kind of frustrating to see people that are so locked into this kind of like, you know, I guess you would say this place of like, you know, I would almost say conservatism, you know. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And like, obviously I don't have any answers, you know, but I think it's good to just, you know, at least put that out there.
It is very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
But that's very difficult. You have to think about how the,
Well, I don't think there are any best practices right now. We're in a very unstable, complex systems. And best practices are for simple systems that are working already for most people. So you have a best practice.
Yeah.
And when you have complex and stable systems like the one we're in, we have to be experimental.
Oh, I agree.
You have to come up with experiments, and you have to have different kinds of interventions. And you don't have a clue to what's going to work. You have no idea. But you have to do something to forestall this chaos that will happen if we try to oversimplify a complex system. And that's what happens when a chaotic system. That's why the fascists love chaos. You get the fascist leaders who come in who will give you order really fast. But it's, of course, as we know, we've talked about previously, it's an order that will not last for very long. So I think we're in this, but I want to make a plea for utopian, for concrete utopias. I'm quoting Oscar Wilde, a map without utopia on it is not worth looking at. I also want to quote from a heroine from a Tennessee Williams play, Blanche Dubois. She says, "I don't want reality, I want magic." Of course, she's a very tragic figure and she went crazy at the end of the play. But I think I think one of the things that I think is suggestive here, if we just want to be experimental and see what happens next, how can we use our imaginations creatively rather than destructively? I'm thinking about what Gebser said about the mental structure. And he talks about deficient and efficient forms of the mental structure. The deficient forms of the mental want to quantify, find an algorithm for everything. And if you can't quantify it, it is not real. Only the quantifiable is real. That's deficient. Efficient forms, however, are open, to the previous structures, rather than hostile to the magical and the mythical. So I think Gebser was suggesting that the integral, the higher octave of what he's calling the integral, or the aperspectival, or the second order culture, whatever we want to call this new emergent age we're all hoping for, would not necessarily be anything new. It would be actually revisiting previous structures with curiosity and openness rather than rejection in order to quantify. So I think we're in the cul-de-sac right now of a lot of our science is dominated by the search for the ultimate algorithm. And I think that's going to, have disastrous effects. But I think we can. What happens to the mental structure if it wants to explore the magical and the mythical?
I agree.
What happens when the mental structure can go into a dream space and acquire lucidity? This is a very old technique that the Tibetans were doing it, and many people are meditating now, and many people are doing these kind of hybrid states that were once considered in Western psychology impossible to have. Now we know it's not true. You can get a a degree at Stanford in dream studies where they have labs where they study this stuff. But I'm wondering what would happen if there were enough people who were interested with that healthy mental structure to go into the magical and the mythical. I suggest that we could liberate, maybe for the first time in history, the subtle realms. And I believe that's happening already to some extent through our technology. I'm borrowing here from William Irwin Thompson, who was a student of Gregory Bateson, a student of Lynn Margulis. He was a real leading intellectual figure back in the 70s and 80s with the Lindisfarne organization. Francisco Varela and Maturana, all those, the Chilean biologists, autopoiesis, all that stuff. He was working with that. And he's making the suggestion that a lot of the suppressed energies and of the magical and the mythical, that the rational mental structure suppressed so much of that, but it's coming back through our technology. Just look at YouTube and you'll see these old ancient ideas coming back with different costumes, you know, or there are, you know, people who never went through the mental structures, but they can use this technology. They may still be in the magical or the mythical, as some terrorist organizations are. They can use this technology too, and they've never really gone to where many would call a healthy middle structure. Anyway, I'm just sharing that the future may be about much more about the different kinds of pasts that we have suppressed or have amnesia for, but that haven't gone away.
Well, it's weird.
They just haven't been represented particularly well in our current situation.
Well, because all these kind of like distant sort of, you know, pre-modernity almost seems more futuristic than modernity itself, you know, and it's like, at least to me, that's sort of my interpretation of it when I actually see these, when I look at these cultures and when I see what they were actually doing, how they were representing themselves, how they were collectively represented. To me, it just seems like something from a distant place down the line. And so I actually really do agree with a lot of that. The only issue that I have is what we have now when we're talking about sort of experimental politics. They're functionally just recodified forms of like neoliberalism, you know? And it's like, it just seems to be like we're stuck in this place where people, like, they're not reaching far, like we're still stuck in this one world where we're not breaking into this world of what you're saying, like the magical and these subtle realms. We're experimenting still within this very binary, constrictive place. And so this is the problem that I have when people say, well, this is a great new idea. And it's like, but to me, it doesn't seem to be going far enough. Like, it's just, you know, like, that's one of the things that I have problem is, like, I just don't see these solutions that are seen as utopianist. I just see them as they don't push it far enough, because they're not pushing the metaphysical realm, because they're still engendering all of the same wants and desires and metaphysics of this kind of like neoliberal condition, you know, which is constructivist, but it's not a myth. It's not like a magical constructivism, you know. It's not there's no real myth behind it. There's no mystery behind any of it.
Well,
you know? So wait, what were you saying? Sorry.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to add something to build on what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because I'm in agreement that our current politics is pretty bad and is dominated by this neoliberal kind of globalized version. But I think there's a different kind of future. There's the globalized future, which we all know and hate, many of us. Some people love it. 1% are doing just fine. But I think we're all trapped to some extent in this old into this, but I think there's a new kind of planetary future, which is different from the neoliberal globalized future. And I think we can contrast and compare those differences. I think there's a planetary future that's more ecologically driven and appreciates the fragility of it all. And I believe that is that kind of planetary future would, I think, be very friendly to that Gebserian idea of liberating the subtle realms through a healthy middle structure, rather than an unhealthy middle structure that wants to stop all of that, reject it, and put forward this quantifying kind of scenario which is dominating our discourse right now. But I don't think we're going to have a new politics unless we have new people who want those new politics. And I think that's where we have to sort of wean ourselves away from our addiction to the fearless leader who's going to take us to this promised land. I just don't see that in anybody's politics right now, in Europe or in America or in Canada or in South America or in Asia. I just don't see it until there are enough people, and I think who have a different kind of interior space and are sharing different kinds of interiors with others. And I think it is going to be a combination of many different factors that are going to to make this a concrete possibility, the possibility that becomes concrete. But anyway, I'm just sharing that because I think there's I don't think it's inevitable that it's just going to be globalized, and I think one of the things that I find so attractive about Davor's theory is that it isn't about the old left-right dichotomies, those frozen binaries, and the way the left has projected our future is a very sterile one. And you know, it's not about who owns the means of production anymore. So those are all real, or you know, that there's going to be that the unions are somehow going to have an enormous breakthrough anytime soon. I mean, I think that article that TJ shared, you know, those jobs are not going to come back. So let's get some sort of basic universal income, just so people are not terrified of how they're going to make a living or how they're going to put a meal on the table today. That's going to release a lot more creative space in people's lives if they don't have to worry about those immediate kind of concerns, while others don't have to worry about any of that at all and are so disconnected from the ecology that they get the bad news after everyone else is pretty much aware of it, but they're the last ones who are informed because they can't even open up a can of tuna fish because they've never had to clean a toilet before. You know, I've worked for these people. I've worked for the filthy rich. They shit in gold toilet bowls. I swear to God, I've seen it. And they don't have a clue about what it is that normal people who have to pay their rent and who have to worry about their mortgages.
Wasn't it one of the Kennedy who said that he didn't realize that there was a depression on until somebody told him about it back in the 20s and 30s? Yeah,
and this is a real danger. These ruling elites, you know, are so cut off from reality. And we see, you know, we can say all democracy has real shortcomings, but, you know, there's a lot of pressure on politicians if they want to get reelected that the majority of their population isn't starving. And there's it's a selfish kind of altruism for politicians if they're aware of what's going on. But I think that's what we're getting is a huge disconnect. Look what's happened with Brexit. Look what's happened with the parliament. I mean, the simplest things, nobody seems to have a clue to how to get anything done. So anyway,
that's democracy's problem if your people are starving. If you have an authoritarian government, you don't care.
Well, I don't think any of us are starving yet.
No,
but some people are malnourished. Yes, they are. Some children are malnourished. We know this. In the US of A, that's a shocking reality we have to deal with. But anyway, I'm actually on some days I'm actually quite hopeful. Even as things get worse and worse and worse, I think so many people are disenchanted that they're open to believe in something different than what they've been taught. I think the American dream was always pretty sinister as far as I'm concerned. It never interested me very much, and I did not pursue it. But those who did are real disappointed that they put aside so much time, they put so much time and energy investing in this, and it didn't come off. And they're really pissed off. So I think there's that, the politics of resentment, it dominates right now. And it can be very dangerous. But I also think there's a possibility for something liberatory happening right now that could never have happened if everyone was okay with the status quo, which I think fewer and fewer people are now.
But that brings us back to our culture problem. I wanted to bring up one of the points in the Millman article, or not the article, the MSc. I guess it's an article or a book. It's about, wasn't long enough to be a book, but it wasn't short enough to be an article. Anyway, he seemed kind of skeptical that the liturgy, or the attempt to make a story out of a latent stress, or a latent stress story, could precede the actual stress event. And he cited Germany, as a matter of fact, that, you know, Hitler was able to come to power and kind of use the story, but then he kind of made it so it was impossible to really build a true culture of that. I was wondering what Davor, what you thought of that. And then I guess the broader question is, what we're really doing here is reaching for the liturgy that breaks us out of the rut that we're in now. But can the liturgy precede, we're trying to avoid the catastrophe, can the liturgy actually precede the event that brings everybody together, or is that realistic at all?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, well,
okay, yeah, it's complicated. No, I mean, of course, I'm making jokes because I don't know, because it's really a problem. Yeah. I mean, based on his theory, of course, it's impossible. Maybe I should, as I said last time, just mention quickly that that his full book offers, in the original version, 5 ways how to tame, how to influence the culture, the organism culture, the selfish being culture. This book that I gave you, I haven't read fully, and so I don't know exactly what he's writing in this book. So I don't know what he's writing there about Hitler, but I know the theory itself. So by his theory, by the original theory, I don't think that you can produce counter narratives. As I remember, the closest thing you can come to, as you say, liturgy, right? So another narrative, an alternative narrative for the culture. The closest thing, as I remember, but I have to look it up again, would be that you try to, how did he say this? To minimize, to make the culture aware that the stressors are not so stressful or something like this. So there's a second phase, after the MSc event, when the relaxation starts. So he gives this 5 points where you can influence the system in his original theory. And in the second phase, there was some way to make, actually I forgot the German expression also. It's anyway, to make somehow there's a way to make to prevent a strong cognitive field to develop. You can relax, so to speak, the culture before it starts crystallizing in these reactions, in the systems in this reactionary systems, so to speak. But okay, I mean, what can I say? So my idea was clear. I mean, as I said last week, the only way I can see right now is this, at least, and that's how also the dreaming and imagining comes back. And that's why I said you cannot make jumps by imagining futures in science fiction or anything. So the idea was this, to extrapolate it. So to extrapolate the history of humanity, so to speak, and then this is not a speculation anymore. You see my point? This is a difference. So you can produce whatever kind of speculative ideas and whatever is going to happen, but this would either go with the stress system, so to speak, with the current liturgy. It would be, so to speak, complementary to it, right? Or it would go against it.
Against it.
You're right, or it would go against it, and then it would be, how to say, yeah, you know, people would push it away, how to say this, you know, reject it. People would reject it. Okay, there's a third way, of course. It just can stay invisible, right? So the cognitive system doesn't see it at all, neither as danger nor as positive. It, you know, it just disappears. It just slips through the net. Anyway, so the idea was in that case to produce a story which is not a story but an opening, in that sense that it's aligned with the system, but at the same time that it's a more attractive version of the system, so that it's a new attractor, so to speak, that is neither against nor for, just an alternative in which the system can glide into, you know, so to speak. So this was my idea. I mean, if you derive it from this theory, if this theory does make any sense at all, you know, so because the systems are much more complicated. It's not just mental stress reactions. So it's, as we said last time, it's also about the distribution of resources, you know, and of everything else. So it's not only this, but still, yeah, at some point, yeah, how should I say? It's a difficult question, you know. So I don't know if you've ever been in Denmark. The Danish people are very intelligent. So if you ask me what is the most civilized country on the planet, you know, it's Denmark. So people would not believe it, but yeah, it's Denmark and Sweden, it's Scandinavian. So so for example, I mean, okay, Israel is also very intelligent, but on a different level. So the Danish people are very, how should I say this? Okay, I'll give you an example. So in Germany, when you go to the grocery store, just at the cashier's check, you have like these huge amounts of sweets for children. I don't know how it is in America. Like just where you put your stuff, you know, when you how to say this? When you check out, right, at the supermarket, there's like whole you know, how do you say this in English?
Oh, gum and candy and
yeah,
we have
so
that.
I mean,
We have that here.
but you know, just at the end when you get out, right,
Just
when you're
right where
waiting
you're
in line,
about
so
to
to
pay.
speak, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's on the height, you know, of the eyes of the children. So they,
Right.
you know, they want to take it. So you make consumers out of them in the beginning already, right? And it's all pure of sugar. It's not healthy for them. It's just, I mean, it's beautiful. Of course, children love it. There's no question about it. The children
That's why
love
we put
candy.
it there.
It's kind of universal. But yeah, exactly. So, but the interesting thing is in Denmark, you know what they do? They forbid that. They didn't do that. What they offer there is like dried up carrots and nuts and whatever, dried up fruit and stuff like this, you know, and baby mini carrots, which look kind of interesting for children, but they are not sweet. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of interesting. So the point is, it is possible to do clever politics. You know. See, it's not that it's impossible, right? I mean, you just need the right amount of people. But Denmark is a very special case because we're only 5 million people, and we have certain traditional values and ethics that make it more, that make it, how should I say it, that make them more collective oriented, right? So you have 5 million people. It's not so difficult to be effective with politics.
Right.
If you have 80 million, like in Germany, with very different, how to say, geographical areas also, like, or imagine America with the state of Washington and the state of Texas or something like this, two very different realities, right? So it's much more difficult to get this effective politics. So what I just want to say is that at some point there will be, at some point it will have to have an effect on real institutions and on real regulations. The question is only who and how to make this real, right? So even if you have this new narrative, at some point somebody will have to decide how to make it real, so to speak. It is possible, but the question is also again a scale. Wait a second, why did I get to this? No, yeah, because of the Mühlmann story. Yeah, so for example, yeah, this is again, yeah, you know, I would even say typical Mühlmann. It's really like a typical Mühlmann example. So if you go to America and tell the people, no, we need to regulate this, then they will say no, right? Like in Germany too, where we say, no, I'm an entrepreneur, I want to do whatever I want because the market is regulating things. You know, you're taking away my freedom or something like this. If I want to put sugar exactly there, I will put sugar there, right? But in reality, it's not. It's just a lobby thing. It's the sugar industry lobbying in politics to have this law, right? So in Germany, they try to all the time, basically. Every year you have a proposal to get rid of the sugar for children, right? Because it's not good for their teeth. It's not good for anything. I mean, at least they can buy it, of course, but not in this amount force. You know, you shouldn't force it upon you. But basically, it's lobbying. So what I'm saying is this: if you people know it's bad. People know it's stupid, but some people want to have it, right? So you have this. So the regulation stays, the law stays. But why does it stay? Because we always can rely on this set of values. Don't take away my freedom. You see what they can always legitimize what we're doing and keep up the system by referring to this special set of values, which has historically grown, right? And so the question would be, how can this be detached? Maybe, yeah. How can the current elite, so to speak, or those who are blocking the progress, how can they be detached from the values that they use to, so to speak, keep themselves in power? You see what I'm saying? So we have a problem. We have two different systems, basically, that in reality are different, but it seems as if they are not, but they are different. So there are two different points where one needs to attack. Anyway, so the point is this: the whole thing, the whole democracy with lobbying and capitalism is outdated. So this whole system doesn't work. It only runs on the simulation of its values, basically. But
it works for 1%.
Yeah, okay, exactly. Yes, that's what I'm saying. But the other people keep it up. They support it because they think it still works, right? Because the media, I mean, you know, the whole narratives are constantly, the public sphere is constantly presenting as if everything is still in order, right? But it's not. It was hijacked basically by a certain class, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah, maybe okay, maybe I don't know. Maybe I was just so to speak thinking out loud and kind of investigating. You know what I'm saying? The point where this new liturgy can have effect, so to speak, or at least. I mean, the first step would be, of course, to deconstruct the cognitive field of vision, as Mühlmann calls it, so the cultural cognitive field of vision. But this is very difficult because people will say, "I don't like that. I don't like my, reality to be deconstructed." Especially if you don't.
But I think it does have to start with the fact that people are dissatisfied with the reality. I mean, that you can grant. So, I mean, if you can start people, I mean, we've got the Democratic, we're talking about the United States for right now, where we only really have two parties who are, if we can attack the polarization and you start getting people to vote for candidates, you don't have to vote out the two parties, but you can start picking and choosing, really get to know who the candidates are, what they stand for, and maybe, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and kind of reinforcing that checks and balances. That at least reinforces the democratic principle. Polarization is horrible for a democracy. Polarization is the first step. When you can take your issues, it's like John was saying before, if you can reduce them and take what was complex and just try to simplify it into these electronic media bite-sized things that people just latch onto, you've already started to attack the basis of your democratic system. The democracy needs complicated issues so that people have room to compromise and negotiate about things. So we start kind of chipping away there at the power structures and then kind of working our way out from there. And that's just a matter of conversations with as many people as you as you can convince.
Well, I'm just going to back up a little bit. Thank you all. This is really challenging for me. You mentioned the extrapolating the history of humanity and something about with the current liturgy. And you could also reject the current liturgy. I'm not quite sure about what liturgy means, but I think the past has certain motifs that we draw upon in those moments of crisis. And I think he mentioned it after 9/11, empty churches were all of a sudden full of people at midday, on a weekday. There was, and I think that that was a very special kind of circumstance, a very traumatic circumstance. But to some extent, I think humanity is now, we mentioned this the last time, we're mourning, we're in grief for modernity. Modernity does not work. And I believe a lot of people have acknowledged this and have moved on and are moving on. And there are many people who haven't. And I think we're, and they're in that fight, flight, freeze kind of dynamic. And I think it's very hopeful that we're learning a lot about trauma, and that there's polyvagal theory is coming. A lot of people working in the area of trauma are looking at this very hopefully, that we're learning about the physiology of trauma, and that there's the vagus nerve, which is a wandering nerve. They call it the wandering nerve. It goes through the viscera, along the spine, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, the rest and relaxation and the active aspects of our natures are regulated through this really complex nerve that starts in the back of our brain and it goes all the way down into our gut. But that this can be, but that fight, flight, freeze pattern can be, we can redo it so that those are not the only responses that a person has. And that this vagus nerve is connected to the voice and to the eyes. So we can hear, when we're in conversation with people, we can tell through their voice a great deal about their affective, their emotional space, and the messages that they give and receive are enhanced or inhibited by this. But if this new social system that is possible when we heal these problems with this vagus nerve, I think that this kind of new social system that could start happening. And also, I think that, and I speak as a person who's studied trauma because I experienced a great deal of trauma when I was very young. And I was very aware as an adult that I had a lot of abilities and skills, but certain circumstances would trigger inappropriate responses. And so I had to sort of learn how to monitor this very carefully and how to retrain my attention, how I could reorganize my behavior through redirecting my attention. And I started to do that with other people as well, who were having similar episodes. And I also worked with the elderly and people with dementia. And I was able to enter into deep levels of rapport with other people with severe handicaps. And I know you work also, TJ, with the disability. And I think these are very promising signs that we can reorganize and redirect our attention. And attention is extremely important for our sense of well-being. So when we're talking about the history of humanity, I'm wondering which humanity are we extrapolating from? Which history? And because there's that perceptual system that one could say is universal, that we can still identify with those operational chains of our ancestors who are working with, you know, they had that spear, the bow and arrow, and then the trap, and that evolution and how the trap is organizing all those previous experiments and performances. So the whole hunting project is in that trap. So I think studying these operational chains, as you brought forward in this theory, is so interesting because we still have the same, our perceptual system is still the same as theirs. And we can imagine very easily, I think, putting that together the way they did, reconstructing the archaeology, that project that you were engaged in, Davor. I think it was very fascinating how, but then there's that cultural perceptual system, the culturally perceptual system that walks into the ATM and knows automatically which buttons to push. And, you know, those kinds of, our technology has shaped our perceptual system, and that's not universal. There are still people who don't have computers. There's still people who don't have smartphones. And you see like those horrible floods that happened, was it in Madagascar in Africa recently? Just decimating villages. I think we're going to see, and that's happening here too. I mean, we're seeing enormous floods and, you know, dams that don't work anymore. The infrastructure is collapsing. So disasters are going to be happening. And we're not planning for this particularly well at all. So I'm just saying that I think the grief is real and we should register it, but we should redirect our attention, and we should take some motifs from our personal past, that is of use, and also our collective past. I mean, when you look at history and the history of transformations and the relationship between technology and different peoples, it's a pretty dazzling kind of, we come up with some amazing things. Also, it's incredibly tragic as well. So I just want to hold all of that. I think the tragedy and the horrors of war and trauma, and also what would happen if there were many more people who had gone through their trauma and beyond their trauma and could redirect their attention to these very subtle, these real subtle capacities in their somatic intelligence. What kind of maps would these people be making about about a potential future that we are not making now, because too many of us are just regurgitating our traumas and reliving them in our intimate relationships, or and getting fragmented even further. So I'm not saying I have any answers here, but I think there's some different kinds of interior spaces that people can share with one another. It's not free of risk, but I think that when there's a threshold, and people they know they have to change, and then they will, and the system pops, but they have to reach that threshold or hit rock bottom, whatever you want to call it, before that happens. And I just think we're at that threshold. Many, many more of us than ever before have either crossed that threshold and are reorganizing around having gone through that, or they're getting ready to go through that. And I think it's going to happen in the next decade for sure.
That brings us back to trauma is good, though.
If you survive it, and if you
survive it and you get to the relaxation state.
If you can integrate that, and integration is a very loaded word. I'm not even sure what it means anymore. But if you integrate it rather than dissociate from it, and if you dissociate from it, you will reenact it over and over again, and you will be triggered, and it'll all be flooding your system all over again. It's just what we know about trauma.
Yeah, but I think Moolman's point, which was interesting, is that that's kind of what cultures do. And then for good and bad, that's what cultures do, is that they relive this. And as long as you can get, like you, John, you just said, as long as you can get through it and draw a positive message from what you've gone through and survived, you can reinforce that. Again, so trauma kind of feeds those collective identity reinforcing, structures that go through and that keep your culture alive. But then in order to change that in any way, you kind of have to, I keep coming back to the theme of you have to almost have a rock bottom experience, and then you can start to rebuild from another MSC event. And that's what for me, what you had asked about liturgy, and I linked it with mythology, I believe last week. It's just that story. That whole, from the time the culture forms through the events that it goes through, and that whole kind of reinforcing thread in your collective experience. So you tie all of that together, and like Barrett had said before, so getting people to kind of come out of that rut, getting people to kind of, it takes a shock to the system to get people to kind of move away from that, and then start to envision. Yeah, I mean, not the artists and the prophets. We're already trying to experiment with things, but just to kind of get people into that next next phase is this.
Well, just bringing this close to home with all this the talk about the reparations for Afro-Americans being compensated for slavery, and there are a lot of politicians who are talking about this, along with the universal basic income. I'm sure a lot of these white politicians are just pandering to the black vote. I'm sure that's a lot of what it is. And it's just going to end up being part of putting it off on a panel to study it more. But I think that there is some energy there.
No reparations for slavery, reparations for Greenwood, but not.
And I know it's not universal among Afro-Americans. I've heard a lot of intellectual Afro-Americans who are against reparations because they think it's pandering, rather than coming from. But how do you put a price tag on something like that?
Well, yeah,
how are we going to apply the price tag on the oceans, for that matter?
Is who pays? It's like
right.
That it's like half my family, they emigrated here, post transatlantic slave trade, and the other part of my family's Native American. So do I pay? Like, do the corporations, JP Morgan, pay because they have some history, with utilizing free labor? So it gets to be this very complicated thing, and we can actually simplify it by, I support some form of universal basic income, and kind of look and say, well, there were irises. I mean, you go throughout history, I mean, in every culture at one point or another has been under some form of violent submission. It hasn't always been this sort of linear trajectory, and I understand it's something to talk about, but what point is the conversation just an obfuscation tactic to actually pander to a constituency that people want because they want to hold some form of political power, And I think that, and it's really interesting actually when you talk about when you brought up the sort of thing post-World War II with Germany in the maximal stress sort of cooperation period that failed because the United States decided that they were going to actually have soldiers stationed there for decades, So, and it talks about how, he talked a little bit about how if you're confronted with your victor, and there are many there are many arguments to be made that we didn't defeat the Nazis, the Soviets did. So, I mean, but we were still a part of that force against them. So part of their culture, not only because it was like a culture of this, as you said, like you create the myth, people buy into the myth, you create order out of the myth, and then it becomes this thing that can no longer sustain itself. It wasn't sustainable to begin with. So I thought that was actually pretty interesting. I think it's interesting how Germany is kind of like, the head of the European Union in many respects, or at least really far up there, even, post this kind of situation, so it's actually I thought that was actually an interesting theory when he talks about how certain cultures don't necessarily gain that amount of verticality. And I'm sorry, I kind of probably have to leave in like 10 minutes or so because I have another thing I have to get ready to go to.
We're going to be wrapping up at 10 o'clock. We usually go about 2 hours. So we have 10 minutes so we can think about summarizing what we've learned today.
Yeah.
I'm far from any answers. That's what I've learned.
Yeah, definitely. Can I say something, please? Maybe in the end, just to. So there are several problems that we have here, from my perspective. Also as a sociologist. So I understand this trauma idea is interesting in general, right? So we said that there is something about it, so to speak. So we all agree on this. There's only one problem, and this is the upscaling. So what works for a person doesn't mean that it works on the same system level as societies, right? So this is a different thing. I'm not saying it doesn't, or in some ways, so to speak, but this is a complicated question. As we said, especially also because there are different types of structures in these systems. So it's not always about normativity or motivation or, how we live in the world or something like this, how we feel. And because there are also very clear factual material structures that need to be maintained, to keep everything up, at least for a while, right? So it's a little bit complicated in that sense. And then I wanted to say something else about this magic and magical thinking. This also, why this is problematic, because John, because now I would have to ask you into what culture exactly you want to go back, to what magic of what culture. You see my problem. So because Gebser is too formal, so he's very broad and very general, right? So you can go into there's a nice example, but I forgot actually where it was. I think it was in Papua New Guinea or something like this, an example. So you had like one little culture collective which was living down in a valley, in a river. Then you had another culture which was like a little bit, let's say, to the north of them, like on the side of a mountain. And then there was another culture which was on top of the mountain. In Papua New Guinea, you have like, or wherever it was, you have these plateaus, these mountain plateaus where people can live up on top of the mountain. So the interesting thing is that all of these, although we were on a technologically exactly the same level, right? Because we are the same archaic, early, the technical term is primitive or primary cultures. Okay, not because we are primitive or stupid, just because we are the first stages of complexity. So these primary cultures, technologically, they were all very similar. The ones who were living in the valley were more like from the fish and whatever they did, and the other ones on top of the mountain. But the interesting thing was that their normativity was totally different. The ones that were in the river were very aggressive and how to say, bellicose. Do you say bellicose in English? Like very war prone all the time. Like, yeah. And very aggressive, and their normativity, and now you see Mühlmann, how it comes in, right? Their normativity was based on strong competitiveness, so to speak, and everybody who would cross their land would immediately get, whatever, killed or whatever. While the people up on the hill, they had a totally different, they were like the hippies of this island, like mellow and everything is fine and we are all friends and stuff like this, so why is that? Well, I mean, it's just an example. Maybe it's wrong also, but of course it's clear when you're the culture in the valley at the river, you will be crossed all the time automatically by others, and others will try to get you all the time. So the only way to survive is to become precautious. That means to become aggressive, even if the others don't want anything from you. An accident can happen, and this is enough already to be destroyed. You know what I'm saying? So the shamans and the rituals in this culture, in the one in the valley, were totally different than the ones up on, and also their music was different. Everything was different, but they were living vis-a-vis, so to speak. They were seeing each other, and it was the same. So what I'm saying, it's a little bit difficult to go back to this archaic, to this complete human, to this idea of the true pure human, or something like Gebser, as the people believed in this time. When Gebser was living, this was the same time when you had this movement of the life reformers, this Lebensreform or life reform. This is the people who invented granola, to eat. And to do nudism, to go to the park and do naked gymnastics. Why? Because now you're going back to nature. Now you're going back to your true self. You are letting the sun, so to speak, filling up your batteries or whatever. You connect with reality again. In Germany, actually, until the Nazis, there were more people in nudist clubs than in football clubs at this time. So it was so popular, like this whole gymnastics in the park and doing it naked and stuff like that. And it was not sexual. Of course, there was also sexual, emancipation involved in this, but it was not primarily sexual. It was really like a health, like aerobics in the 80s or something like this, or yoga today. And this was the time also, Hermann Hesse, when he was writing and when Gebser was living. So this is all one back to the real pure human nature, to this pre-alienated existence. Of course, there is something to it, right? Because the civilization makes us, we talked about sugar earlier, it destroys us in some way, right? So it's good to reconnect, even if it's with granola, you know, like, or going naked to the park or whatever. But the point is, what I'm just saying, it's difficult then to say that this holistic mindset with Gebser, to which I agree, and there's more to say on that because it relates to post-formal thinking, post-formal operational thinking. But I'm not sure if you can go back, so to speak, to such a type of magical, archaic. It doesn't. So what I'm saying, just finish. Let me please. So what I'm saying is maybe what would be an interesting approach would to think about what. I know this is very technical, but what to think about what you could extract from it, what could help us today. You see my point. So very specifically to look at what.
I think it was Gebser's.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Well, just briefly, because I know we're running out of time. I remember the magical and the mythical and the rational are happening every day to all of us.
Yes. So it's
we go to sleep at night. We have dreams. We wake up the next day. We make plans. I remember one time I had a dream. In the dream, I was hearing a song, The Impossible Dream. I was actually singing it. To Dream the Impossible Dream. It's an old Broadway song, very popular. I woke up, went to the office. I was the first one there. I had my cup of coffee. I was the first to arrive. No one was there yet. And I opened up my journal and I wrote down, I had a dream. And the dream was, I was singing The Impossible Dream. And as soon as I finished that sentence, from across the street, a piano started playing. And the piano was playing The Impossible Dream. So I'm just saying this is a very ordinary kind of experience, but it was also bizarre because think of all the factors that had to align themselves for something that was outside and something that was inside. That acausal connecting principle, as Jung would call it, a synchronistic event. And he made a career out of studying these kinds of events. So they happen to everyday people. So I think this is an example of the magical. And it did have a fascinating kind of, there's a fascination there because you realize that what appears to you is just the norm is not that. There's a lot of weirdness going on. There's a lot of slippage. There's a lot of things that are happening in the cracks and in the crevices of our ordinary consensus reality trance states that makes the world go round. I also want to just add very briefly a tragic, but also an awesome story about some children who were kidnapped in a bus. And they were taken out into a desert. This is out in California. And the kidnappers, they buried the bus in a sand pit. And fortunately, they were saved by two boys who were in the bus. And they got everybody else, got all the children out alive. But a lot of trauma therapists went down and wanted to study these children because they had these theories about trauma and memory and what is remembered in a traumatic episode. How much of it is imagination, how much of it is reality. And so they interviewed these children. What was interesting is they all came up with pretty much the same story about what happened. But when they were buried alive in that bus and the weight of the bus was, the roof of the bus was starting to crack open and the sand was starting to come in, two boys, they all froze, except for these two boys who broke out of that frozen state and climbed out and saved all the kids. So I'm just saying that I think that's just a terrible story, a terrible trauma, but also it's not inevitable that everyone's just going to freeze. There's always going to be somebody, a small percentage of people who wake up and say, hello, everybody, it doesn't have to be this way. We can do something different. And I think that will be maybe a minority response, but I think we can heal these deep wounds and splits. And if it's reparations, that's okay. I'm all for reparations if it works. If we also give people polyvagal therapy to go along with reparations, not just universal income, but they also need polyvagal therapy and a universal basic income. So I agree, you can't just have, you can't just train people to take better care of their physiology. Of course, that's a very useful thing to be able to do, but you also have to, you know, create institutional supports as well and have environments that support this kind of exploration. But I don't think it's going to become anytime soon, you know, something that everyone has immediate access to. I think we have to sort of cultivate this and, you know, use our imaginations as we have been doing on this call today, and sharing our different points of view and hopefully coming up with something that's, you know, useful and delightful for all of us. So I once again want to thank everybody for your time and energy, especially you, Davor, because I know it must be very late over there. And thanks for everybody showing up tonight. And
it's early, you know, not late. No, it's good, no problem.
So I learned a lot, and I hope you guys learned something too. And if you want to make a summary statement, I'd be delighted to hear what that might be. So thanks.
Oh, thanks.
No, thank you. Yeah, again, Davor, thank you again. We still haven't gotten to the outsides that I wanted to talk about. But
no, not yet.
You know what?
Yeah, let's try it next time. Okay, maybe. So
Okay, yeah.
because I know then what I think I know how to get to the point, so to speak, next time. Yeah.
Great. So maybe we could do it in 2 weeks. Would that give us enough time?
Let me just
That's
take
fine.
a look for a moment. Wait a second. Because the point is, right now I'm writing an important paper that needs to be finished as soon as possible. It doesn't matter. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. No, stop. 3 weeks doesn't work exactly. So either next week or 2 weeks. Yeah.
How is that with you guys? Is there a paper or something that you want us to read?
Me or no?
Yeah.
No.
Is there anything you want us to read or prepare for?
Well, if you like to, I can come up with something, definitely. But if it's next week, it will not be much, so to speak.
Okay. So would you guys like to do it next week or the
We
week
don't need
after?
to decide now, actually. Sorry. It's not for me. It's not important. If you want to decide during the week, it's no problem.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we can go back to the thread and discuss it if it's okay.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll do that on the thread then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah,
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Everyone. That was
Bye-bye.
great. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. How do I turn this off? Like here. Rip.
Night, John.
Good night, all.